Hello and welcome to another edition of P5Live Sessions, where we will explore and improvise with code and see where that takes us. Hopefully learning something along the way for you or myself. Thanks for watching live or in the future. Tonight, I think I will play with sine, maybe even with sine, maybe again with sine. I play with sine quite a bit just to have things move and be in motion. And I think it is, it creates a really nice kind of movement back and forth. But I'm curious what happens if we put sine inside of the sine and sort of get like a, I don't know, I'm curious what happens. Let's first just play once with sine and see what that thing is doing. So I am going to have an ellipse. I'm going to be clever and use some variables, like let x be sine of, let's say, frame count times 0.1 times half the width. And then what I could do is say be half the width plus this positive negative number. So we have x, I'll put it in the center vertically and make it 10. And maybe make it 30 so we can see this thing better and slow it way down. Maybe even slower. All right, so now this thing is moving, go back and forth. Let me turn off my line numbers. I don't think I need those on for this. And it's interesting to turn the background on and off and let that thing trace out. And you can see, I can see at the edges that it kind of slows down and then speeds back up again. But let me already start to see, check out what happens if I put a sine within a sine. So instead of just having this be like times this particular number, what if that was a sine itself? And this is a question if this needs to be absolute, maybe so it doesn't go negative. Be another sine of frame count times 0.01 times 0.2. How much do I have to slow that thing down? That did it so much. Maybe this should be normal there, and this should be slowed down. Oh, it's doing something kind of strange. Ah, there. Okay, it was slowing down. Let me speed it up a little bit. Maybe hide the background so I can leave a trace and see what that trace is that this thing is doing, or maybe just background with some fading out. That looks super consistent. So it's not yet doing what I was looking forward to. Let's see. Maybe I'll make this an oscillator. Let me say oscill1 equals a sine, and then it's a question if I should really use frame count or invent my own frame counter. Frame count times 0.01. So then I could do something like, let me tweak this a bit and say, let's do width divided by 2 plus. And instead of this sine, let's trash this and just say, be that also 1 times half the width. Okay, so it's moving quite slow. Speed it up a little bit. Okay, it might be worth making my own frame count. Let fc equal 0. And I'll say fc plus plus to start out. Just growing 1 and say fc. And that'll be the same thing. But then I have the ability to slow the thing down and up here control if it grows by a slower number, and it shouldn't be quite as jumpy. Here it might be interesting to put a sine, but let's put this back at 1. So this thing is just kind of moving back and forth. And now I want to test out putting another sine inside of this. So instead of this 0.03, I want to create another os. Let me say let os 0 be a sine wave of fc times 0.05. And this maybe times 0.03, this number that I wanted to get here. And then I don't know if it needs to be positive or negative. Let's see what happens. It freaks out. So let me try absolute valuing it, if that changes it. And if I said nope, let me go times. So what's a bit confusing is maybe it needs a bracket around this whole thing. Aha, there we go. Okay, maybe just missing a parenthesis to isolate things. Let me slow this one way down. There we go. And now it's doing, let me move the thing down a bit further, times 0.75. So it's still kind of freaking out faster than I would like. Maybe down 0.2, what will that be like? Maybe even 0.1. I could also switch to angle mode, degrees, and then I could use not these tiny, tiny fractions. But this is kind of interesting. It kind of moves. Has a kind of funny rhythm. It's not quite doing what I thought it would do. I kind of expected it to, if I open up the blackboard, I kind of figured it to move like so, and then kind of maybe slow down and then speed back up, and then slow down and then speed back up. So maybe it's about addition and not multiplication. What happens if this number is bigger, then this thing goes kind of nuts. If it's a way smaller number, what does that do? Quickly test something. Okay. So let me speed that up again and slow this one down. Whoops. See what it does for the size, times 50. Just to get an idea how it's affecting. Okay, that looks super consistent. Because this is such a tiny, tiny number now. Let me make that bigger again. Okay, has a quasi-chaotic looking structure. And if I get rid of this ABS, what does that end up doing if it goes positive and minus? Okay, that's one way to play with like a sine of a sine. That's putting a sine inside of a sine. Let me test again doing a sine next to a sine. So I'll just override what x is, and I'll say it equals a sine of fc times 0.05 times, and instead of, it would be like width divided by 2 would be just this constant back and forth. And instead I'm going to say times a sine times a sine of fc times I don't know, 0.04 times with divided by 2. Maybe this is getting a bit closer to what I had in my head of what I thought would happen. A little bit. What if that's a tiny number? Interesting. What if it's a big number? Okay, what if this is applied to the height? And I just make this thing go vertically. And make that a cosine. That's how we could go into Lissajous territory. I'll go back just side by side. Maybe I duplicate this and make, make one for the y. And just test making one of them a cosine and see what happens. Plus y. Wow. Let's clean up the code. This should only be height. There we go. Now we stay on the canvas. Interesting. So that's something kind of like a Lissajous curve, but it's doing some sine of sine. What about if there was a cosine inside of that? Not quite as cool. Let's go back to a sine. What if that one is double? Yeah, start to create these patterns that aren't quite as smooth as most Lissajous curves would be. Maybe I'll let it not get quite as big and leave a longer trace so you can see just what this thing is doing. Okay, but then it starts to get very consistent. And I think its general movement should be slowed down. So if I drop these way, way down, then we get a much smoother trace. And that's its repeating pattern, unless it's allowed to break that by like a little bit different ratio, especially something that doesn't fit so perfectly into each other. Starts to look like a nice spray can movement. And if I put this at some fraction like a 5 on there, give it a fresh clear. Okay, let me temporarily disable the Y so this thing goes back to just doing its back and forth kind of rhythm. Actually, wait, I'll take it back. I'll bring it back and do the exact same thing. Let me put the exact same values and see what happens if these are both. If the only difference is a cosine. Versus a sine. Because maybe instead I'll tack on yet another sine wave onto this. Times a sine wave times this and make that some other value, 1. Yeah, now it has some kind of complex loop-de-loop things it needs to do. It repeats because there are still perfect ratios of each other. But interesting testing out how many of these sine iterations can we have it do. So it looks like in the end it's a lot more interesting to have these tacked onto each other instead of trying to like fit them inside of each other. Let me add another one to the Y. Got sausage forms happening. And change that one to a cosine. And maybe a different speed. Speed it up on that level. Yeah, quite a bit of curve. Let me test out once making lines instead of these circles so that everything is traced together. So I'm going to make a pxpy and have them equal 0 at the beginning. And then I'm going to temporarily turn this off. Let me get the line first. So line will be the front half of this thing. First I'm going to need to make stroke white. And it's going to go from there to px to py. And I'm going to need to say that px equals this original, let me just say, yeah, it equals this whole thing. And py equals, just to keep track of where the line had been a second ago. And I can turn off the circle, although that was interesting. Refresh. Oh, we shouldn't let this thing draw if px does not equal 0. So it can only draw from its growing form. And makes quite a smooth set of curves. Let me make the stroke weight thicker. That should probably also be based on some kind of crazy sine structure to get thick and thin. And maybe let this thing fade out more so we don't see too much of that trail there. But it is interesting seeing the trail it had already been on and that it lands perfectly on those same spots, just because these ratios are still all fitting into each other. So if I said something like, I'm going to clean up some of the code, get rid of what we aren't using. Let me trash that thing. Maybe before I trash that, I will give this sketch a name. Whoops. Interesting. Let me refresh the page once. Okay. Let me give this a name and call this P5Live Sessions. What is this thing? Sine. And then I'll clone it and clean it up a bit. So we're not using this at all. We're not using this. And maybe the circle is interesting to turn on and off, but we're just going to draw a line, and this should also get its own interesting sine wave around these stroke weights. So let me do a sine fc times 0.01, something slow, times 5, or 15. And then the thing is getting thick and thin. Maybe it should never get less than 2. And then instead of going right into that 15, this is getting into the negative territory. These need to be absolute valued. And that's probably definitely playing a role that these are a lot of the time positive and negative. But let me do another ABS. Sine wave of fc times 0.02 times 15. Let's see what that does. That the line's going to get... Technically, I can make it probably happen quite often. Especially if it's a thicker line, then we'll start to see the edges of it. What if it's a really thick line? Blop, blop, blop. Yes, now it starts to go into like a calligraphic territory a bit. Let's keep tweaking these positions and speed here so these things can run faster at times. It's way, way faster. Let me just make it a little bit faster. A little bit faster, a little bit slower. Let's see what each of these effects have on it. Quite a bit slower. Okay, it's making quite a repetitive pattern, it looks like. Let me clear the background. It's interesting, of course, too, to have like just a zip zap, leaving a little trace when there's only a little bit of opacity, or more opacity rather. Then we get it leaving this kind of burn in, simulating a vector display of sorts. But let me go back to 10. What happens if some of these are absolute valued? That they never go into the negative. Absolute value, what's that going to do? Gets a lot more angular. That's interesting. It takes away the smooth bend. I'm going to take those away. Speed some of these up. I'm going to try ones just like ping-ponging who is a cosine, who is a sine, and giving them the same speed and just see what that does. All right. Whoa, interesting. Whoop, whoop. Whoop, whoop. Bring it back down to 10. Okay. And then what happens if it does even more of these things going inside of it? So that was with like an 8 there, an 8 and 8. And what if this is, what if I tell this one it's allowed to go up to 1? We get these special kind of bounce off the screens. And just to check if it's a 01. Then it's going to take quite a while to work its way around the screen. Maybe nice for a minute to turn off the background entirely and let it trace this thing out and see what that thing does. All right, it finished the image. That's kind of all it's going to draw. So I can turn the background back on. That was at slowing the thing way down. So what if I slow this one way down? What does that do? Okay, that super quickly hits this little loop. So that's not interesting. That value did better when it was bigger. So let's keep that up there. And I think that's giving us these. Almost like flower petals or so. All right, let me put that back where it was. And test out this side. If this side is slow, what does that do? Back to the same. So if I make this one smaller, I guess assumably it does kind of the same thing that we saw on the other side. And what if it's way bigger? Okay, I'm going to go way smaller. And I'm going to add one more of these things onto it and see how many levels of, of like sine, on sine. What effect this has on it. Yeah, it's quite interesting how these things are quasi-symmetrical looking. They're repeating and not repeating. Get my mouse back. If I speed one aspect of it way up. Okay, I kind of lost the ability to go along the edges. That was quite cool before. I'm going to change this to a 0.01 and make that part way smaller and see what that does. Interesting, now it's a tiny little form. It would probably be interesting to try and tack these things onto each other. But I quite liked it back a ways where it kept touching the edges. I think I might already forget what those values were. It wasn't this, what was it? It was, I could always just undo for a while. I think this had to actually be up at like 8. There we go. This is quite interesting when it touches the walls and creates this pattern here. What happens if this is way smaller? Okay, then I can leave a lot of traces going out. Maybe I should turn off this stroke weight from being as thick as it is. Stroke weight 0.5. And temporarily turn off the background. Give it a fresh render. And now I could just wait for this thing to do what it's doing. We're going back to Moray displays. Accidentally checking out what happened yesterday. But maybe it's interesting to throw this thing inside of a loop so that I don't have to wait for it and it can just render. Let's see if it keeps going after it makes this 90-degree angle. Yep. Fun. Parabolic curves. Okay, I'm patient, but I'm not that patient. I think I want to try to get this thing looping so I could just say like do a ton of these iterations. The nice thing is now using my own FC, this FC could just grow a ton of times and then it should just repeat this thing a ton of times. Although it's not bad to have to hang out and wait for it to do its thing. While it's doing its thing, let me try and get a loop going. So I'm going to, I'll press Control A is a nice way to turn off live coding so that it's not going to automatically update while I type and then I can screw up and the code will be broken for a little while, but that's no problem because I'm slowly figuring out what I'm writing. I is going to equal 0. I is going to go, it's a question, how many of these things do I need? Let me actually turn this code off for a second. And I should find out how big FC is. Right now is a pretty good time to find out what FC is. It is 6,200. Okay, so we made it all the way around with about 6,000 iterations. Damn. I don't think I want to loop 6,000 times, but let's see what happens when we loop at different amount of times and grow this FC based on this. Whoops. This is why I turn off live coding for a second. So I'm not going to do 6,000 times, but it's good to know. I'm going to write that down. 6,200-ish was all the way around with the current setup. Full rotation. I'm just going to try like 100 iterations at first and see what that does. And then I'm going to move my FC down into this thing so that it grows inside the loop still by 1 and see what happens. Let's see, let's take a picture of this first. Control S. So I'm saving the code and a PNG. And let's recompile. All right, it's just doing everything faster. So then I can turn the background back on. Whoops, I turned off live coding. Then I always screw myself up that nothing's happening. I have to remember to reactivate auto compiling. This is this live coding up here. Control A turns auto compile on and off. All right, so now it's like at 100, it's doing kind of one of those things at a time. If I say 200, then we'll just do much more. If I do 400, much faster. 600, it takes it half a second. A microsecond, we can start to get some strobing flashes happening. Interesting. Epileptic warning. It's going to blink a bit. I'm going to turn that off. Let it do its thing with fewer rotations. I think it's quite nice having this like slowly walking out. Kind of building a screensaver at the moment. But now I think with this kind of setup, it might be nice to tweak this formula and see how it draws this many lines out faster. So I'm going to clone again and say, I guess that last one was like the start of looping. So I'll rename, and this was like sine loop. And now we're going on from there, and yeah, just slowly change these numbers and see what effect that has on the thing. Ooh, that makes a nice scribble halfway through. I really like that split moment where it like squiggled down and then squiggled back. What if it's an 8? Interesting. So at the moment I'm like really stuck in this kind of round structure. So that would be interesting to slowly break out of. Ooh. Interesting. Yeah, this loop does quite a bit for things that we couldn't see. What do I want to do? 0.1. Go the opposite way and grow this number. Whoops, 1, 2. 1, 6 to be double. Because then it's all about these ratios. In Lisa Zhu patterns, these ratios between two sine waves or a sine wave and a cosine, whether it's a 1-to-1 ratio or a 4-to-1 ratio or this would be like a 8-to-1 ratio. I think when it goes too fast, it starts to collapse a bit and get this edge quality that's not quite as smooth looking. Let me play with some similar ratios on these other numbers. Interesting. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. Back to a 4-to-1 ratio. Nope. What about the other way? Then it's interesting just going less and letting one of them, whoops, be the big number and one is the smaller number. Or when they are equal, they sort of hang out next to each other. A 3-to-1 ratio, it's going to go up and down 3 times for every time it goes left to right. That's creating interesting like waves within wave looking structures. I'm going to put that back and test out again, having a higher number here so it draws this thing back and forth even faster, maybe 250. Okay. Eventually, pretty soon, I need to go into 3D and take advantage of a third axis. Will be quite fun. But there's still so many little things to test out. Now sine instead of cosine, I'll go back to that. What about sine here? Doesn't make a huge difference. What about cosine here? That makes a big difference. Okay, so having a sine and a cosine here, had that happen so that with the sine there, it's going left and right. What if I say cosine and sine? Butterfly flapping its wings. I think it was better the other way. Every once in a while it's fun to throw a tan in there, which I don't use enough. I should do a whole section just on, or one episode just playing with tan to get a feeling for how that thing works. I don't use it enough. 04. It's interesting what's happening on the inside there. On the outside, not as much. In general, the thing is whipping back and forth quite fast. So I'm going to try something out and go back to 32, which I liked. And I'm going to slow down the FC and have the FC grow even slower. So it'll take smaller steps between all of these things. 2, 5, 1, 2, 5. So now it just takes longer to do all the things it was doing, and then I can have more of it. So it just slows things down. I can still repeat a bunch of times if I want to see a more complete form. Maybe in the end it comes back to where it was anyways. Not sure if that makes a huge difference. Can leave more of a trace. Let the stroke be a little thicker. Let's start it over once. So this inner, I really dig this inner wave. I'm curious what I could do about the outer wave and make it not quite as crazy. What if I say divide by 4 so the whole thing just doesn't get quite as big? And what if I switch all of my cosines to sines? Whoops. Create some interesting volumetric forms. That's probably also interesting, testing out once doing a begin shape, end shape, begin shape, end shape, and shape, and drawing some of these as just vectors, like one continuous vector. I'm going to say no fill to make sure it doesn't try to fill the thing in. And instead of drawing a line, let me draw one of these as just a vertex. And we get almost the same thing, a little bit different. Because now it's more like a closed form. But then what gets quite cool about doing it this way is I get to do fun things here and say like points. And instead of drawing solid lines, now I get these point structures, which are probably a little hard to see on the stream. Can make it a little thicker. They probably look like sand dollar-like or some kind of underwater fossil. Let's let this thing get bigger again. Instead of just being a quarter of the height, let it get way big, and maybe it's even nice to play again with letting it get off the page. Right now we've been contained on the canvas the whole time, and it can be nice and immersive to let the thing grow itself, double the size of the height. Let that trace out for a little bit, take a picture once in a while. Boop. Grab a couple screenshots of it in progress. It has kind of a silver quality where it faded out. Maybe I'll do one quick like totally fade out and turn off the background. So now I can leave a huge trace out. I'll just capture it a couple times. This is also an interesting point to just stop playing with this and switch to some visual feedback just to make everything softer and have all those points kind of glow a little bit. I think I will definitely clone from this point so that I could come back to this and just make everything a bit softer. It's also a place to start playing with shaders. The last version of P5Live down in the demos, way down in the demos, now has shaders, and there's some really interesting shaders for some blur effects that can manipulate the geometry. They can give some nice quality of line to everything you're drawing. But anyways, I'm going to rename, not export, I'm going to rename this thing. I'll call this one particles. I'll come back to it and clone it. And this is no longer particles. Who knows what this is? What was I going to do? I'm going to call this immersive, because I plan to make everything bigger than the height. So I'm going to make the background back on. And now tell it to be like 2 times the height. Which now things are probably going a little too fast. Interesting. So many numbers to tweak. Let me let the thing get 2 times the width. It's leaving a really faint trail in the background. Maybe it's also interesting to clear it once and let it leave a longer trail. So now I'm going to trace these things out. Yeah, in the comments about having a shader session. That's a tricky thing to say. I totally agree. It would be a good chance for me to learn how they work. I'm still a super noob with shaders, but they can be a lot of fun just to explore and see from a working shader what happens just tweaking all the numbers and where can you bend it and tweak it, either based on the geometry or color shading it's doing. Another future session, I still need to figure out the exact audio setup, is doing some VJ style, because the whole point of P5Live is reacting to audio. But I still have to work out exactly what the source of audio should be for copyright and whatnot, and then just the right way to flow the audio through this setup without causing any weird problems. So I think it could be nice to turn this stroke weight back on to let it kind of get thick and thin. Whoa, too much. Maybe just to 5. Nope. Tried it. Back to the other one. So points is an interesting one. Lines is an interesting one. It just takes that vector shape and breaks it into a bunch of pieces. There are lots of different ones. There are triangles. Triangles. Or there is quad, but I don't think that any of these will make a difference until I have more vertices being drawn. So it's really about like nothing or lines or points. Okay, let me go back to nothing and slow some of these things down again. It could also be interesting to make a tiny class out of these, so there could be a couple of them running parallel, making different forms, kind of having a key position of where they go, and then they could do their different kind of drawings at different speeds, different sizes. I guess it's a big question of like, what are the numbers that go in here and what effect do they have? Every single change makes a huge difference. But it could be nice to have a bunch of these things kind of drawing and doing their little thing around the canvas instead of just a singular one. So I'm going to save this. That was immersive. I don't know if that was really immersive. I'm going to clone this and call this a class. It's always good practice for myself as well to get into just making more classes and trying to work more and more in object-oriented way. So I'm going to turn off live coding for a minute so I can do this thing, and I'm going to call it a Kali for calligraphy. Give myself some space. And there's going to be a constructor to initiate them, and they're going to have a display function. What do I need to keep track of? I'm not even using the px anymore at the moment, but maybe it is interesting to hang on to. So I'm going to have a this.fc, which starts out at 0. I'm definitely going to want to tell them where they should be. So I need an x, a y, and they need some kind of a size. It's a question if I give a width and a height, but I think it's enough just to give I don't know. It's probably interesting to have a width and a height. And then what else are they going to need to know? They're going to need to know kind of kind of how fast they are. I'm going to need to know like a loop count. for replacing this 50. And then I should know maybe the last little thing is just like a general speed and have everything be based on that speed. So some of them are fast and slow. And I'll have to figure out how to make these numbers kind of random and unique inside of it. Okay, so let me patch all these things. This dot x equals x. This dot y equals y. This dot w equals, equals w. Basically I have to say all of these, this is this particular instance, each instance having their own variables. This dot speed equals speed. Okay, so all those things are patched up. And now I think I can already merge the code from up here down below. Let me steal this part here. Plop it into the display and clean it up once. And now I need to replace everything with like this all over the place. So I'm just going to say, technically this one doesn't need it, but let's, oh no, let's do it. This x and y is this. No, I take it back. I'm going to leave that how it was because I was going to feed where the thing should be. So maybe they'll be here and here. So this is actually this dot x plus this value coming in. This one here is going to be this dot y. Scoping should make that not a problem. All of these FCs need this in front of it. I should probably do a find and replace, but it's safer doing it this way. This is going to be the width, which is actually this dot w. This dot height. I'll play with those later. Okay, the position, I don't need my p, x, and y at the moment. And then you end a shape. And maybe just to be safe, I'll do a push and a pop, so they don't screw each other up. Okay, so that is the speed they're growing. This here was this dot loop count. And I still need to figure out this like speed. And maybe what's nice to do is just generate a bunch of numbers that are somehow based. I don't know, they could be super chaotic. What should I do? I think I will do I think this speed will be like the base value of one of these. So maybe like 0.04 would be a base value. And then I'm going to generate a bunch of, what am I going to call these things? Divisions will be a array. And when you start out, it's going to be, I'm going to create a bunch of these things. I is less than, I'm going to create 12 just to be safe. This dot div dot push. A floored random up to like I think a 4 to ratio or a 6 ratio should be enough times this dot speed. So what that should do is give me a bunch of numbers that are based on whatever number I fed here. And then I'll use those throughout this thing. So I'll say like this here should be this div 0. And I'm just going to go through and grab those different values. This will use 1, 2. It's probably a clever way to kind of loop this structure here as well, but first let's do it manually. Okay. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to say, I'm going to have some callies. Let callies equal an array. I'm just going to create one at the moment. Callies.push a new callie. And I need to tell it where to be. Let's put it in the center. Let's tell it to be 500 by 500 just to test. What else do I need? The loop count. Let's do another 50. And the speed. Let's start out with 0.02 and see what happens. Now I could turn off all of this. Turn off this. I'm still not on live update. so we can find out if this worked or not. For let C of Callies C dot display. And want. Doesn't work. What is wrong? Cousins is not a thing. I must have a typo in there. Co. Sine. Let's start it over. Is it maybe from up here? Callie. Let's debug again and clear everything. A new Callie constructor. Class Callie. Constructor. It could be because I'm using a let x down here. Maybe I should call this like x offset, y offset. Let's see if that makes a difference. Y off. Totally died. Bummer. Stroke. Why is it not happy with this thing? Let Callies. Push a new Callie. Maybe it has to do with this structure. Maybe I should just do a normal for loop. Callies I. It's not saying anything. It's not doing anything. Interesting. Let's see how many we have. Print Callies dot length. Okay, 1. So it's not dead or anything. It's just not rendering yet. So that's good. There's one of them. And if I turn that off and I say print I get 0. That's good. So that loop is working. So it's something wrong with the display. And the speed, I had said 0.02. What if I said 0.2? Width divided by height divided by 500 for its width and height. This dot W. Doot. Maybe Y. Try to figure it out. We let something render. So we at least see something happening, and I'll tell this thing to be times 0.25. So when it is working, we'll see it show up. And let's see. Display. We have a push, no fill. Let I is less than this dot loop count. This dot FC, and FC started out at 0. That's good. Times, maybe this dot div didn't work. That would be not surprising if that's a problem. Let me test this out. What is this dot div? Where did it go? Print this dot div. It showed up for a second. It's an array. Yep, it's exactly what I wanted, a bunch of numbers. Okay, so that's not the problem. Where's the problem? Sine. Is px incrementing? What the hell is px? Damn, thank you, good call. Px had to do with the way up here. And I was using it as the px thing. We're not using it anymore. Awesome. Live coding online for the win. There we go. There's our tiny little shape. So now it needs to just be able to grow bigger. Okay, it's not doing its thing quite yet. There it is. Sweet, thanks for that tip. Yep, we did not need a px anymore, so I should really clean up the code and get rid of whatever I wasn't using. Maybe it's nice to bring back the ellipse. And maybe the line will be interesting. Yeah, maybe I'll want to have a this.px and introduce that later. Okay, but the thing is, once in a while when I refresh it, it becomes a flat line. So that's a bummer that sometimes it doesn't produce numbers that create a three-dimensional shape. Put it in the center. Yeah, so then the question is how to make sure that it always has, maybe I should say 1, because that could be a problem. If once in a while it's a 0, maybe like this. Yeah, that seems to kind of, ooh, that was a nice one. Damn, I lost it. Ooh, that's a nice one too. Interesting. Okay, time to make a bunch of these things. We have 5 minutes to make a bunch of these things. So what I would do is make a little grid to generate these things. I'm going to turn off live coding again and say for. Let's decide what our grid size is going to be. I'll say let grid equal. Let's have a 5x5 grid. Let I equal 0. I is less than grid. I plus plus. 4. And now we need a j to make a 2x2 grid. Or rather 5x5. J is less than grid. J plus plus. And now I can just map the things out, and I could say let x equal mapping. I comes in, it goes from 0 to grid, -1 technically. And I want it to go from like width, 10% of the width to 90% of the width. Maybe 20 to 80, so they have some space. And copy paste, make a y and a j. And a height and a height. And then I can move this thing into that loop. These are going to now be the x and y. They need a size. I should probably just do like width divided by grid, height divided by grid. And then they need to know, let's just start with 50 or even 20 to start with, and let's use the same speed and see what happens. All right, hard recompile, there we go. Squiggles all over the place. I think they need definitely different speeds here, so I should do like a random from 0.01 to 0.03. I think their heights are still too big, so maybe times 2 times 2. So these things will be the opposite, divided by 2, divided by 2. There we go, so now they're kind of self-contained, doing their little thing. Could be nice to quickly jump into 3D and let these things be in a 3-dimensional space. Have a couple minutes. So I can test out having a ton of these things. If I go times 10, I could have a bunch of these. I don't need to be quite so pushing for the space. They can go closer to the walls. There we go. Yeah, that creates an interesting, looks like we're doing some crazy calculations. All right, let me save this one. That is already a class, and let me duplicate it and give it a new name and call it WebGL and test out what this looks like in 3-dimensional space. WebGL, and then this all changes. So then I should go like minus width times 0.4 to positive. Minus 0.4 to positive. And that might already be enough to change. And because we're in WebGL, we have a choice of like background or no background. So if I turn off the background for a bit, they can trace out their shapes. That's quite cool. And now I could let them actually just do more loops with a background. It's probably going to slow down. I should probably turn this down to like 5 of these things. Or what would have made sense is to draw all these things to a layer, so then I could do some fading in 3D. We don't have that much time. But instead, because we're in 3D, I'm curious what happens if I just do like some rotate Y, radians, frame count. Cool, then those things are actually in 3-dimensional space, which could leave a background in 3-dimensional space. Maybe I go back to points. Yeah, I think that gets a little messy. Turn the background back on, maybe turn off rotation for a minute. Maybe just tilt it a little bit. Rotate X, radians minus 45, positive 45 rather. Actually, what they should do is they should also get a Z-axis off. I'll copy paste and call this Z. I'll use the next digits that I had. I only went up to 5, so I can go 6, 7, 8. And then I could say this is just Z off. And technically, you should now have 3-dimensional forms. If I do a rotate Y, yep, you can see there they have a little bit of a 3D form. If I go like, actually let me just do a orbit control 5. So I can go check out what they look like in 3D space. They're a little chaotic because they have to loop so many times. I wonder what happens if I let this thing get bigger, then I'll start to get closed in forms. So I won't have to loop as much. Okay, it starts to look kind of GIF-like. Yep, something to keep messing around with. Save that. I could move it a little bit, refresh it, save, refresh it, save. It is in 3D. It maybe doesn't need to be 3D, but it opens up other possibilities to keep playing with. Or maybe it's interesting to build them in a 3-dimensional grid and then have these forms to kind of walk around. I could sort of turn off the constant erasing of them and kind of draw their form once, and then it might be interesting to kind of walk around and explore. I guess to do that, we'd just have to have an array waiting to store all the points where they landed. Yep. Hope you had fun watching sine, cosine clusters. And that's it for tonight. Be back next week, next Tuesday, 9 o'clock Central European time. Thanks for watching.